So we're going to be switching over to our national speakers. It's my pleasure to bring Maya Dutta into the conversation, and she'll be discussing the power of ecosystem restoration. Maya is the Assistant Director of Regenerative Projects for our host organization, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here with you all today, and will echo the thanks for Richard for his really incredible presentation, kind of setting us up. So I'm just going to do what I hope is an introductory view on the power of ecosystem restoration to kind of handle some of the challenges that we're facing. I could talk about this for the next 3 hours, but we have a lot to get into. So we're just going to do a little bit of what ecosystem restoration kind of has to bring to the table. So I like to start here with an image of the Loess Plateau, which is the site of one of the most ambitious large-scale restoration projects that has taken place. On the left is an image from 1995. On the right, the results of decades of restoration in 2009. And to me, the power of ecosystem restoration is right here. It is the ability to transform a landscape from degraded conditions to one that supports life in all of its complexity, in all of the cycles of water, energy, nutrients that kind of make us able to survive and make other living beings able to survive. We go from conditions of degradation where water doesn't run, where crops don't grow, where soil is eroded, and the human communities are experiencing this through rampant poverty and hunger, into an area of abundance where there's reliable water and food and sustenance, where biodiversity returns, where people can live kind of proper and good livelihoods in relationship to the land, within those limits, but within a much greater abundance than the land once held. So how is this possible? How is this done? In short, it's by kind of appreciating and understanding the relationship between biodiversity and climate, between ecosystems and life, and kind of what makes our climate and our planet the way it is. And as Jess mentioned, I work for Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, where the thesis is kind of in the name. We really understand the active role of biodiversity in the planet and the climate conditions. I think a common conception is that biodiversity and living things are this passive victim of climate change, just suffering from all of the things that humans are doing by putting up excess CO2, affecting the planet the way it is. But all of us are participants in our ecosystems, and everything is contributing to kind of the situation at large. We have, certainly through our kind of excess power and our effects on our ecosystems, changed the calculation. But in fact, these other species, and particularly having kind of robust, complex ecosystems full of biodiversity, change our ability to retain and cycle water, to cool our local and our global situation, to make best use of the sun's energy that's coming into our system. So we really need to appreciate that aspect and really treat these living beings and these healthy ecosystems as the allies that they are. A lot of this looks like shifting the focus on, any single metric, but I think particularly carbon as the dominant topic of much climate advocacy and much climate solutions, to really a systems focus, looking at a holistic way of understanding the way that life is governed on our planet and making those interventions for greater abundance, for greater resilience. So just briefly going to touch on that kind of phenomenon of carbon tunnel vision. This is a graphic from Jan Konietzko that has been circulated widely at this point, just kind of showing all of these interrelated issues that we often narrow down as a way of trying to tackle one thing at a time, trying to tackle one thing alone. But in fact, when we start to understand, the issues of climate and water, consumption, inequality, biodiversity, when we start to take these together, we also are able to look for solutions that intersect. It can be really, really overwhelming to look at these as separate issues. How are we going to solve it all? How can we manage it all? And really the answer is in understanding their overlap, understanding their interconnection. Another kind of modification on this graphic is in the Earth crisis blinkers. This was inspired by carbon tunnel vision. And this is a kind of a brief look at both the problems and then possible solutions that we can take, that if we widen our focus, we can start to use kind of these approaches of bioregionalism, of transitioning our energy usage in kind of a just and equitable way, in uniting our desire for technical and technological innovations with really communal and social innovations that change the way we relate to one another, so that we're less, playing a game of whack-a-mole of problems and instead really getting to the roots. And a lot of this that I'm speaking of kind of in general terms really echoes through our society, through our political and our economic structures, and through the ways that we kind of have institutionalized our relationships with one another, our relationships to the land, and kind of perpetuated a system of extraction, both of natural resources, but also extraction and exploitation of people and of time and of the way that we are then able to live and able to dream. So even our science, our language, our ways of understanding are largely based on domination rather than on reciprocity and mutual relationship. And I think to recognize that, to recognize the fact that our effects on and our connections with ecology are largely hidden, largely the sources, the costs of our food, the costs of our materials, all this stuff that we've accumulated. We don't see what goes into that, and we don't see where it goes once we've discarded it. So the question of consumption, the question of waste, when you look at plastic pollution, when you look at kind of all of these, what we sometimes classify as other effects on the environment, we can really understand this as our desire to live in an extractive way rather than a circular or restorative way. And finally, we kind of take this approach to time. We are in a culture at this point where we have so much access and so much kind of immediate power that we believe we can really live for right now rather than living in connection with the 7 generations before us or the 7 generations after us. And this is where we can really learn from and kind of follow the example of Indigenous peoples and traditions to look at abilities, kind of ancestral wisdom for being in relationship to the land and being in relationship to one another. At this point, we have talked a lot in the climate space about sustainability, but what we really want to do is to pivot from sustainability to regeneration. If we sustain the levels that we're at this point, our levels of both atmospheric carbon, but also of plastic, of kind of the trends to heat, the trends to ecosystems, that's not a very good situation. And it's not one that I want to live into for the next few decades and want my descendants to live into for centuries. So what we really need is to regenerate, to restore. A lot of us came to kind of global warming as the problem. When I first learned of climate change, it was through global warming, and we really need a cooling solution. Again, this is where the power of ecosystem restoration is really crucial, because nature plays a buffering role in the earth. It plays a buffering role locally, making sure that the extremes of temperature, the extremes of precipitation, either a lack in terms of drought, or an excess in terms of flood, that play these two roles in a cycle. Nature is able to buffer this through its cycling of water. Nature, in fact, is able to play a contributing role to a more consistent rainfall. It's also kind of stabilizes the extremes that we feel and we sense. So this is just a very small snapshot of this phenomenon of a hot summer day in the city of Melbourne, where the temperature differential between a shaded area under trees and open asphalt is about 30 degrees Celsius. And that differential is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is absolutely tremendous. And the health outcomes, the adverse health effects, the heat deaths, these are not forecasts for the future. These are things that we're experiencing now, and we have to address now. And when we look at the question of timescales, looking at emissions reductions alone will require waiting decades and centuries for a re-regulation of climate based on simply lowering or halting CO2 emissions. So with restoration, however, we can be buffering some of these effects and actually working towards a livable climate, towards available clean air and water within matters of decades rather than centuries. And this is really essential. So very briefly, looking at the problem of CO2, we can also kind of look at some of the solutions in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that is sequestered during the growing seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. The seasonal variation is kind of blown up in the corner here to show that when the Northern Hemisphere, which has kind of more land and more photosynthesizing capability, is in its growing season, we actually see CO2 levels fall. And so if we can kind of maximize and support these activities, we have the ability to sequester carbon year over year, and as well as provide benefits like filtering water, providing habitat to biodiversity, growing food, and again, kind of making our livable planet supportive of life as we know it. I won't have time to go into all of this in detail, but some of the techniques and guidelines of ecosystem restoration are wide and varied, but they include a transition to regenerative agriculture, which improves soil health, increases biodiversity, decreases, again, the flood and drought cycle, and restores small water cycle. They rely on kind of restoring freshwater and coastal wetlands, again, huge for carbon sequestration, for buffering against wildfires, and buffering against these kind of threats to extinction of biodiversity. It relies on halting deforestation and restoring and conserving the Earth's great forests. And then in our urban areas as well, kind of taking a new approach to the built environment where we're valuing water, where we're valuing life, creating pocket forests, green roofs, urban farms, and across the board, across all of our acreage of this earth, investing in our soil health, which both retains water, grows more nutritious food, is able to sequester carbon, and oftentimes does so in a way that can support community livelihood and can support the restoration of communities and people along with it. And so here, again, we have to both follow and center the leadership of local communities, particularly Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, because what we're really doing here is training ourselves in ecological recovery, but also all of the aspects of resilience that it takes to kind of go through these intense events kind of in the present and the future, and to come out the other side. It's essential in this to work with our allies, both our human allies and our non-human allies, using the power of photosynthesis that chloroplasts have been doing for billions of years at this point. My colleague likes to say the extensively field-tested method, this high-tech work of creating biomass from carbon and water. It relies on the allies of mycelial networks of fungi underground, which support our seedlings and our vegetation, and kind of increase the fertility and the health of the soil. It relies on all of these kind of beautiful invertebrates, mammals, birds, these things, again, that we're not out there to save, but that we're out here to participate in our ecosystems with. Skip this slide, just kind of a plug for understanding the really beautiful, amazing anchoring work of native vegetation, this in particular in prairies. And I'll just briefly go over some of the indicators of success, polyculture, of diversity of species, and of kind of ecosystems increasing their complexity, and of community-centered, community-owned and led solutions. I really want to stress that regeneration is really much more than ecological. There are these opportunities to really heal what has been damaged in our societies, in our cultures, and take a look at the harm that has been done in order to repair it. This looks like intergenerational public participation. It looks like fun. It looks like giving people an ability to kind of transform their anxiety into action. And, you know, finally, I'll just say that yes, we have to kind of contend with our limits to growth. We can't just grow exponentially, but this doesn't have to be this situation of dire sacrifice. We can really lead fulfilling, joyful, enriching, and purposeful lives, even within these difficult times, because as we participate in restoration, as we increase our connection to one another and to our planet, we can also start to open up to the possibilities of abundance for ourselves, for our friends, for our communities, and for our planet at large. So really encourage people to take part in all the ways that they can, to get involved in eco-restoration, put it in the map, and really participate in this great work of our time. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over now.
Thank you so much, Maya, for bringing the hope and helping us to stay grounded in the solutions, and reminding us that regeneration is a whole new paradigm and way of being, but we also have thousands of years of science and lived experience from Indigenous communities who know how to return to these ways of being in right relationship and are actively doing that work on the ground. So it's my pleasure to introduce Philip Bogdanoff, who is a board member with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. He's also a director for the DC chapter of Bio for Climate. And I also know him from his work as a steering committee member with the Eco Restoration Alliance. Philip, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jess, and to Richard and Maya for their excellent presentations. I'm going to go through a lot of slides very quickly. I think Jim is going to put them up for me. So starting with slide 2, with the bottom line that I want you to take away from this is that our agricultural systems, food growing systems in particular, are already being buffeted by the growing impact of climate chaos. We also at the same time are experiencing a diminishment in our availability of some of our key fossil fuels, petroleum, coal, natural gas. Those are already showing price increases. And then on top of all of that, because of our patterns of conventional agriculture, we have really extracted the fertility out of our soil. We can address some of this, undo some of it. Basically my argument here today is that we can reduce a lot of the waste from the system by relocalizing the production of our food. We can reduce the amount of external inputs that we need to purchase and apply by using different techniques, regenerative agriculture, et cetera, to help close the nutrient cycles. Next slide. This is just an image to give you a sense. On the left is the plants growing and animals grazing to produce our food. The arrows sort of spinning off. Some of it's for industrial uses, some of it's for storage, a lot of it's for waste. And on the right side, the edible food supply consumed, you do the ratio of what goes into what comes out, and we're only 14% effective at producing our food. So a lot of that is because of the large scale nature of this, the wastage that's embedded in the system because of the packaging and refrigeration, et cetera, all the energy inputs. So this is one view that we could change. Next. For the US, this is where we grow most of our crops. The yellow, green, and red, corn, wheat, and soybeans predominate. Blue is cotton, hay and silage in yellow. The bottom there are fruits, nuts, and vegetables, what are considered table crops. Next slide, are really only grown in a few regions around the US. Next slide. Yeah, so this shows you mostly where our food comes from that we eat day to day. This is as of November. Things have changed a little bit thanks to the atmospheric rivers that have been hitting California. You see the next slide, there's an update from a few days ago. We are still under drought conditions in many parts of the country, even in parts of California. This difference is from November to March, barely 6 months. Changes can happen rapidly. I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this as climate chaos unfolds. So this is from last September. I haven't been able to find anything more recent, but just showing that already the unfolding climate impacts on weather has affected table crop production. Next slide is the highlights from the same article on commodity crops, saying that we're basically experiencing severe impacts on our agricultural system. Yeah, global drought situation. More and more parts of the world, significant population areas are experiencing drought conditions. The next slide is showing last summer in France. Next slide shows, perhaps you saw this, the impact on the Loire River, drastic reduction in flow of water affecting not just barge transport of many goods and commodities, but also cooling of nuclear power plants that had to be taken offline, et cetera, et cetera. This is showing the change in the last few months, commodity price indices around the world from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, spiking last spring. They've come down significantly, but still the long-term trend is for an increase in the cost of our food. This is more recent data showing the longer term sort of trend, the variability. Again, we're going to be buffeted. Next slide shows a headline I found a few days ago showing in the UK, food inflation is 18%. Next slide shows, again, this is a little bit old data from last September, but showing the impact in the US, price increases ranging from 10 to 30%. You'll notice the bottom 3 bars there are about energy cost increases. And then every time we do one of these series, I'm trying to find a little bit more pertinent data for your region. This is looking at the economic justice issue. You'll see Ohio is in the mid-range, which is still 10% of the population in Ohio are considered food insecure. Next slide shows the ratio of population to land since 1900 in Cuyahoga County, showing that the population has gone up and is declining a little bit, but the ratio of farmland is still extremely low. different people, if you do some research, you need between 2 to 4 acres per person to grow enough food to sustain yourself for a year. So this is about 1/4 of an acre per person in Cuyahoga County. In my own region, next slide. Again, this is old data. One of the issues we have around this is there's not a lot of data tracking going on. This is from 2012, showing, kind of a random market basket of table crops and commodity crops and protein sources, showing that in DC, in some cases, less than 10% of our food is supplied from our region. Next slide shows vegetable production versus consumption in Maryland. Again, what we eat in the orange bars and what we grow in the blue. Next slide shows fruit. Again, so our region is extremely dependent upon, outside resources. Next slide. So how does it get here? Next slide shows transportation networks that deliver food in blue, and you can see the emphasis on certain regions of the country for sources and others for population centers for consumption. Somewhere between 90-95% of our food is goods in total are delivered on diesel powered trucks. Some of our food obviously comes by rail and by plane. Next slide. Our friend Alice Friedman has written a couple of books, one called Life After Fossil Fuels, which provided some of the theme for this series that we're doing today. She also wrote a book called When the Trucks Stop Running, and she's looked at kind of just a thought experiment. Next slide. And I'll give you a minute to kind of look at this. We have created basically a just-in-time delivery system for many of our goods, including our food. You know that when a severe storm is forecast, certain items on the shelves in the grocery store disappear relatively quickly because they quickly deplete what's in the store and what's in the warehouses nearby. But we are highly, highly dependent upon this diesel-powered network. Richard touched on this a little bit. We are, by all accounts, we had peak production of petroleum in its various forms in November of 2018. We've been on what's called a bumpy plateau. You see the decline there as COVID set in and all the shutdowns, and we've now kind of recovered. I tried to find something more recent than this March 2022. Was not able to, but by all accounts, we're still below that November 2018 peak. Next slide shows the trend over time that's anticipated based on the exploration, the discovery of huge oil fields and smaller oil fields. Takes 5, 10, 20 years to take an oil field from discovery to develop the infrastructure to pump the oil out. So there's a lag time between discovery and production, but based on that, this is the prediction, the blue, the red, and the light green there of what we were going to see from oil. Oil shale had hoped to be able to fill in that gap. It's not going to materialize. In fact, we've seen some headlines you see on the next slide in recent days showing that the downturn may have already begun. Wall Street Journal article, and then the CEO of Pioneer, which is one of the energy exploration and production companies that's involved in the shale industry. So next slide. So the question is, okay, if peak oil is 2018, we're on the bumpy plateau, we may be entering a decline phase. What do we need to do to prepare for that decline? And the Department of Energy, next slide, asked that question in 2005. And Robert Hirsch was the key author of this report that's become known as the Hearst Report. Next slide gives his conclusions. So as Richard mentioned, the renewable industry is largely focused on generating electricity. 80% of our energy needs are in other fuels, and petroleum is used primarily in the transportation sector still, despite electric vehicles and Elon Musk's dream of electric tractor trailer truck. That's not going to change in the foreseeable future. So his bottom line are those last three bullets, that we really should have started 20 years ago to minimize the impact, to be able to minimize the impact of this peaking of oil. We have not effectively started at all. So we are unfortunately going to experience the worst of it. So again, we are, our food production system is increasingly going to be stressed and buffeted. We're going to see shortages. We're going to see a need to relocalize and depend on our own abilities to grow food. And doing that, anticipating that and planning for it is going to take some time. I've been doing a deep dive with colleagues here in Maryland, looking at what would we need to do to shift from growing commodity crops, which are the primary crops, corn, wheat, and soybeans in this region, to growing more food crops. Well, commodity crops, you can make one pass at the beginning of the year to plant your seed. You maybe make a pass in the middle of the summer to apply fertilizer, and then a third pass at harvest time to harvest. And maybe you need one guy driving the combine, another guy driving the truck to collect the grain. And that's about it in terms of your labor needs. If you're going to plant, broccoli, tomatoes, cucumbers, pumpkins, a lot more labor is involved every stage of that process. And then in addition, when you harvest, say, your tomatoes, you need washing, packaging, perhaps refrigeration. If you're going to be doing anything to save that crop for over the winter, you need canning or drying operations. All of that infrastructure, at least in the DC region, has largely moved west, some of it even to California. So we have to look at how do we go about recreating that infrastructure, and it takes many years to do so. Next slide. So we also need to train more farmers. There's anticipated in the next decade to be 1 million farmer gap between those retiring or dying and the entry of new farmers. We need the market systems, aggregation, distribution centers. Housing is actually a problem, providing that seasonal labor, affordable place as close as possible to farms. We need to close the loop on nutrient cycles, phosphate in particular. We flush a lot of it down our toilets. We need to capture that because it's going to become a critical resource for agriculture. So that's my snapshot. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for that context. I think will set us up beautifully for the next panel conversation. But for now, we're going to open up space for some questions. I see some hands. And Richard, if you're willing, I also want to make sure that you're part of this as well. We had to cut your Q&A a little bit short, but I did see a question from Maya. Maya, would you like to ask the question to Richard, and then we can go to Fred?
Yeah, absolutely. I just really briefly wanted, either in the chat or live, if you have some reactions, resources or recommendations for further reading on the energy transition, particularly. I know you've spoken in the past about mechanisms for doing this in kind of a just and equitable way. So would love to look into that further. Yeah, any recs?
Yeah, the literature on the energy transition is filled with a lot of misleading studies that say, all we have to do is build a bunch more panels and turbines and we can easily do it. And on one hand, and on the other hand, there are actual peer-reviewed studies that look into the materials requirements, the current rates and projected rates of deployment, and other, real world constraints, and come to very different conclusions. So the general public has not been exposed very much, I would say, in books and online articles to the kind of real world constraints that the renewable energy transition is facing. I'd be happy to prepare a short list of articles. I've actually written more than a dozen of those myself, and those have links to the source materials, the peer-reviewed studies, and so on. So I'd be happy to share those.
That'd be great. And I'm sure many people would love to see that, so we can circulate that as well. Thanks.
Wonderful. All right, Fred, we're going to pass it over to you for your questions.
Yeah, I first of all just want to say to Richard, Maya, and Phil, congratulations on excellent presentations. They were really, really well done. I wanted to ask Richard and Phil, you spoke of the need for basically gasoline substitutes. And I don't know much about this particular issue, but what are the prospects of liquid hydrogen, which can be made with electricity? Is that a feasible alternative, or is it not?
It's extremely problematic. I first say that both hydrogen and batteries are not energy sources. They are means of conveying energy from one point to another. So hydrogen is either produced through electrolysis of water, which requires electricity, or it's made from stripping it out of natural gas. So you need natural gas, a fossil fuel supply to make it. Batteries as well. To charge your batteries, you need some sort of power generation to put the electricity in it. And that's the issue, the scale at which we use energy. Richard, I know you've heard Nate Hagens and others speak about this. A barrel of oil translates in terms of energy content, BTUs, into about 4.5 to 5 years of healthy human labor. Americans use about 22 barrels a year. So just for oil alone, that's 90 to 120 energy servants working 24/7. If you add in the coal and natural gas, maybe you're up around 300 servants that are supporting your lifestyle, your standard of living. If you're talking about not developing more pipelines or more oil, you're talking about reducing the availability of that energy to power our economy and support your standard of living. So we're talking about drastic changes in the short term. Hydrogen on its own has problems with storage. It tends to seep through metal pipes, create brittle structures. So special handling is required. The fuel cells that are being used to power electric vehicles to generate the electricity to drive the electric motors are themselves very sensitive and complex kinds of instruments. So it's not something that we really should be depending upon in the future, as our ability to repair the infrastructure that we're continually growing is going to start to reduce.
Thank you for that. Over to you, Robin, for your question.
Yeah, I wondered, because the oil companies are basically run by sociopaths willing to do anything for a fast buck, is there a danger as we switch over to renewable energies and stop the subsidizing of oil and give it to them, and they could just say, oh, fine, we won't explore anymore. We won't make any new refineries. And then when the next surge comes and we need more ships, trains, and whatever diesel fuels, the price will skyrocket like it did at the end of the pandemic, 4 to 5 times per gallon, and we'll have a whole economic collapse, and the oil companies will be happy because they're charging huge prices and still making record profits.
I'm assuming that's addressed to me, but Richard may have a comment too. I think, as I hinted, we have created an infrastructure that is highly addicted to fossil fuels. And I'm afraid that's going to have to play out. The ability to make changes in the infrastructure, even if we implement aggressive policies and regulations, it's going to take decades to even reduce our dependence on fossil fuels by half. So my personal position is that rather than fight the oil companies, rather than protest the banks that are investing, I think we should be turning our energy to what is actually going to be even more critical, which is our ability to grow food to feed ourselves.
Absolutely. And so I want to call attention to some questions showing up in the chat. One is directed to you, Philip, from Judy. The question is, how is phosphate captured and recycled? Is it something that has to happen at an industrial level, or is it something that can be recycled somehow on a smaller scale? And Philip, feel free to respond live or respond in the chat if that works best for you.
We literally flush phosphate down the drain whenever you use your garbage disposal, whenever you go to the bathroom for number 2. So we have to capture that waste stream through composting and human manure, recycling, et cetera, in order to make sure that we are be able to put it back on our growing regions.
Another question from Stephanie, and I'll direct this one to you, Richard. Do we have enough fossil fuels to create and maintain the green energy infrastructure that we need?
The answer to that is it depends on how fossil fuels are allocated. The only way that we do is if we allocate them preferentially to the energy transition, which would mean reducing the amount of fossil fuels available for normal consumption purposes. That means transportation, manufacturing, home heating, all the other things we do with fossil fuels. If it's going to take a very considerable amount of energy to build the renewable energy infrastructure that we're talking about, the assumption is that we're going to build a renewable energy infrastructure to more or less replace our current fossil fuel energy infrastructure in terms of magnitude, scale. If we try to do that, it's going to require energy not just for building panels and turbines, but all these other energy using machines that we depend upon. And the energy to build that stuff is going to have to come mostly from fossil fuels because that's 85% of our current energy. So unless we reduce fossil fuels going to other things and preferentially use it for the energy transition, the result is we won't have enough. Absolutely not. And the transition process will suffer. And meanwhile, everybody else will be suffering too. And they'll be saying, oh, well, we can't, gasoline's too expensive. So we demand more for that purpose. And, the whole thing becomes chaotic. Unless it's somehow managed, it's not going to work very well.
I want to thank Timothy for your comments in the chat and sharing of resources around phosphate. I also want to share Anne Burke's question. So what ideas are there to, 1, educate the public about the limits of renewables, and 2, let people understand the drastic changes, as Philip said, that will happen? So how do we communicate these needs to the public in a way that is engaging? Any thoughts on that? I'll pass it over to Maya. Any thoughts? Philip?
Sure. I, in fact, was like halfway through typing out an extensive response, but it's easier to just speak. I do think that it is essential that as we have these conversations and as we disseminate this information, we really need to ground this education work in actionable solutions and the ways that people can actually participate in and contribute to the transition. Because, oftentimes just hearing the dire predictions or hearing the information, we are just unable to really integrate that into our lives, into our behaviors. So yes, we need to understand. This is not to say, no, don't tell people this, but we need to understand these limits and take it further to, okay, if we can't maintain these lifestyles that we're accustomed to, what can we have instead? We can grow food. We can have, in fact, more nutritious food. We can have kind of more beautiful spaces. We can have these positive aspects as well, but we are facing real limitations. So let's start where we are. Let's see what groups are working on the ground, kind of what already exists in our community, and try to make those interventions kind of bit by bit, because otherwise I think to think of it only as these drastic changes or especially as only levers and mechanisms that a government can make, or that a bank can make, or these external actors can make. We can't really wait on that. We need those levers as well. But to say, I'm not waiting, I'm starting now, I'm moving, I'm in collaboration with all of these other entities, and I'm going to take part in this regenerative transition, and to have a little bit of faith that as we do so, we can also kind of increase that capacity, increase the horizon of possibility from something so scarce into an actual, both a livable future and an enjoyable future, something that you actually want to be a part of.
Thank you for that, Maya. And I want to, Philip, did you have anything to add?
I would just say, read everything Richard has ever written, and I'll give you a good grasp of the predicament we're in and some of the solutions. In particular, I like to point out his oil depletion protocol as something that addresses some of the justice issues globally, can also be applied locally. I like the term he's using, managed retreat, as perhaps preferable to degrowth. And I think on his last session with us, he pointed out that part of managed retreat also has to be concerned about equitable, distribution of the resources through some sort of public process for rationing. So I would highlight that. Jim Laurie has put into the chat, mentioned that phosphorus is found in most soils. Healthy soils will extract it from the rocks and trade it for the plants for sugar. So again, our global scale agriculture needs to mine phosphate from biological sources created by bat or bird droppings. The scale of that cannot be sustained. We need to recycle that. But Jim is also pointing out that if we downscale, focus on the local, form healthy partnerships with nature, we likely will be able to achieve what we need to.
Richard, any closing thoughts before we transition over to our next panel?
No, I think it's a great, all of this discussion is great. And I think that the focus on nature's solutions is absolutely spot on, because relying on machines to solve these problems for us, I think is going to be a big mistake. It's gotten us to a certain level of power over nature, over each other, over our environment, over our lives. But I think we're going to be learning increasingly as time goes on this century, the limits to what machines can do for us. So it's restoring natural systems and cooperating together, building community resilience. Those are the strategies that will get us where we need to go.
Again, that's a beautiful segue into our next panel conversation. I want to thank you again, Richard, Philip, and Maya, for getting such a juicy conversation going. And we will answer any remaining questions in the chat. And it also sounds like some resources after this event being sent out to folks who registered.